Now in this second section we're going to start the process of introducing some of the Kingfisher's vibrant colour to the drawing. And to begin this, I'm laying in a base with a light phthalo blue, trying to apply a fairly even coverage of colour, making sure my pencil strokes flow in the direction in which the feathers grow. It's the same process essentially as when you're drawing an animal with fur. These marks need to work in the same direction as the feathers or the fur of an animal would grow, so that any of these marks that show after more layers have been added, that show through those layers, are still going to help to support the impression of detail that you're trying to create. So I've been over the head, filling in these two sections with the blue, and now I'm using my mountain putty just to delicately remove the pencil outline so that I can work more readily without that showing in the drawing. The presence of a hard outline can really undermine the attempts that we're making to create a drawing that suggests something that's three-dimensional. So unless I'm actually going to work over it with a much darker colour that would obscure it, I tend to use the mountain putty, squeeze it down to a nice thin edge and just go along and remove that pencil. Now the colour that I've chosen to overlay the light phthalo blue is Peacock blue. The reason I've chosen this is, as you can see, it has a greeny tinge to it, and although if you ask most people what colour's a kingfisher, they would say blue. That would only be part of the story. Certain areas of the kingfisher's plumage, obviously depending upon the light, certain areas of the plumage will actually appear to have a sort of green, almost turquoise colour to them. So I'm using the combination of the light blue and peacock blue to suggest that slightly greenish tinge, greenish tone. But with a really sharp pencil I'm beginning to introduce some of the detail. Now you can see these repetitive lines of small pencil strokes are curving up over the top of the kingfisher's head. And it's important that you get these angles correct because they're helping to suggest the shape of the kingfisher. You want them curving away and then disappearing over the other side of the bird's head. They're an aspect of the drawing that can, if you get them fairly accurate, can really begin to suggest the shape of this bird. Gradually move across the head, filling in this detail. And what I'm doing now is introducing some of this colour across this cheek patch, this area, which will actually be orange. I'm introducing some of this blue across it because this orange feathers, when they're added, will fracture a bit along their edge, so there'll be fronds of this orange will move across the edge of the blue feathers on the crown. So I'll put those marks in first of all and then draw into those with the orange pencil when I reach that point. As I mentioned previously when we were talking about the shape of the beak, the shape of the head is important to understand as well, so more reference photographs to look at this from different angles will help. And what I'm doing effectively is building an area adjacent to the orange cheek patch where the surface of the bird's head and the feathers almost curve in slightly, so there'll be a shadow cast on this area. The illumination which is coming in this particular drawing from the top right will throw a highlight across most of the head except for this lower section where it curves inward. So we gradually begin to build the colour in this area, and where I want that shadow to be darker, I'll work on it as I am now with Payne's grey, which is a bluish colour. So again we're still acknowledging the predominant colour of the kingfisher's plumage, but we're moving into darker tones to help to build these shadow areas. Now, having applied those first layers of colour, I'm now working over them with a blender produced by Caran d'Ache, and it's called a full blender bright. Now, quite why it has that title I don't know, but the bright certainly applies, because as you can see, as you work over it, not only does it blend nicely, but it also adds a bit of vibrancy to the colour. It brightens up the areas that you've applied colour to. And you can work all over this area, gradually creating a more even finish to the colour, whilst slightly softening the detail that you've put in, so you're creating more of a feathered appearance rather than the spiky one which you had to begin with. And that blender essentially is just a solid wax pencil. But even though you've effectively sealed this surface with a layer of clear wax, what you can do once you've done that is still work over it with your colour pencils, adding more colour, so you haven't prevented the progress that you want to make with the drawing. You can still work over these areas and build the tone, and all the time you're softening, smoothing the texture of the paper, and you're gradually getting rid of any sort of white haze that the texture of the paper might have given you with your original and initial applications. So now, having blended that area, I'm using my eraser pencil, a Koh-i-Noor eraser pencil, just to come in and tidy up the edges a bit. It's very easy, especially when you're blending, working away at the drawing, to perhaps drift over some of your outlines a little. So the eraser pencil with a nice chisel end to it, I cut them so that they are broad and flat, so when you turn it through 90 degrees you've got a sharp edge to erase with. Work that along the edge of the drawing just to clean up any areas where you may have transgressed and created a less than tidy edge to the picture. Now let me sharpen my Peacock blue pencil again. I'm putting detail into this particular area of the kingfisher's plumage. And these little crescents of fine lines sort of suggest the overlapping feathers that sit in that area. And I use my bright blender again on this area too. Having blended that section, I decided that actually it still looks a little bit too fragmented. I wanted more of an all-over even feel to it, so I'll work over it with my Peacock blue pencil again. But as I did over what will eventually be the orange cheek patch, I'm also dragging some lines of Peacock blue into that throat section, which will actually be white, but just suggesting that those white feathers will gently, in places, gently overlap the blue stripe. And this bottom edge will effectively be curving around almost underneath the chin of the bird, so it's another area where there'll be shadow. So I'm doing more work with the Payne's grey, slowly but surely building the tones in the areas where I want them, but importantly not overcommitting. Now we come to this orange cheek patch, and I'm starting by applying a layer using a Tangerine pencil. See, I'm dragging the colour into those areas between the Peacock blue lines that I created. Again, following the line of the feather growth. So on this cheek patch it actually sweeps up and back. So those first few layers curve around the eye and over the cheek, and the lower we get, the more that curve evens out. Remembering not to take this section too far, because that bottom edge there overlaps another white patch of the kingfisher's plumage, so we don't want to take this orange too far down. Now I'm using the Bistre pencil very, very lightly, just to put a base colour in this patch in front of the eye. and then working over it with a bright blender again, just smooth it all out. You can still see a little bit of texture, which is good in terms of creating the pattern that we want to achieve there, but I don't want it looking too spiky, so I blended sections of it. Now I'm coming back in with the Bistre pencil again and building some detail on top. Now this requires some extra pressure, obviously, to make a darker mark with the same pencil. I'm just putting in these little curves of delicate feathers, and that's, you may have seen just what just happened. My pencil broke. Now I can still carry on putting in some of those lines because I've got a sharp edge where it's broken off. But actually what it suggests is I might have been better advised to use a different pencil, perhaps a dark sepia, to get these dark lines. I sharpen the pencil to get some nice, clearly distinct marks, but then applying the heavy pressure that I needed to make darker marks with this particular choice of pencil colour, I pressed too hard and I broke it. Whereas using a dark sepia, which would make much darker marks without the requirement for heavy pressure, might have been a better choice. Now I'm using the burnt sienna pencil, and again flowing lines as before, but these are more obvious because I'm being sparing in terms of how much of this I put on. It's about creating a slightly richer colour, but also some detail as well. And a little bit of work on top. Using another pencil, a light orange, just to blend the burnt sienna very slightly, but also create a richer tone on this part of the drawing. And what you'll find as you work through these drawings is each time you put some colour in another section, it makes sections adjacent to it change very slightly. So as I'm doing now, sometimes you'll find I've got to come back in and add a bit more tone to areas, make changes that have become evident as a result of the addition of new colour somewhere else. Now on this white throat patch, we need a shadow, of course. It's being drawn on white paper, so there needs to be something there that shows where the throat patch comes. But what I've chosen to do, rather than using a light grey for the shadow, is again to use my Tangerine pencil. Because white areas of plumage can often have reflected light on them, so light that's hitting what will eventually be the Kingfisher's orange chest can be reflected up onto the throat. So I've used that orange to create the shadow, and now I'm using my mountain putty to soften it, to knock it back even further so it's just visible. We don't want it to look like orange plumage, we want it to look like white feathers which have some reflected colour on them. And this brings us almost to the close of this particular section. Just add a few more dark shadows with the Payne's grey before finishing this section and preparing to move on to creating the feathers on the upper part of the bird's wing.